Messi's final World Cup could change football history, not just because of what happens on the pitch, but because of what it represents for the entire sport, the culture around it, and the emotional bond between football and its fans. Because when Lionel Messi walks onto the World Cup stage for the last time, he is not simply another player chasing a trophy. He's the living symbol of a generation that grew up believing football could still be poetic, human, and magical in an era increasingly dominated by systems, data, and commercial power. And to understand why this final World Cup matters so deeply, you have to go back to the beginning, to a young boy from Rosario who crossed an ocean to chase a dream, a player whose career has been defined not just by goals and trophies, but by expectation, pressure, and the impossible standard of being compared to legends before he even reached his prime. Because for years, Messi carried the weight of Argentina's history on his shoulders, the constant comparisons to Maradona, the painful finals lost, the tears after international defeats, the accusations that he could never replicate his club brilliance on the world's biggest stage. And yet he kept coming back, tournament after tournament, refusing to walk away, refusing to let disappointment define him. And when Argentina finally lifted the World Cup in 2022, it felt like a closing of a circle, not just a victory, but a moment of emotional release for millions who had followed his journey from teenage prodigy to global icon. But that victory did not end the story, it transformed it, because now Messi no longer plays to prove he belongs among the greats. He plays free of that burden, carrying instead the role of guardian of football's memory, the last bridge between an older era of the game and the modern hyper-commercialized present. And that is why his potential final World Cup carries a significance that goes far beyond results, because it may be the last time fans witness a World Cup led by a player whose style is built on instinct, vision, and creativity, rather than pure physical dominance, pressing metrics, or tactical rigidity. And if this truly is his final appearance on football's biggest stage, then every touch, every pass, every quiet moment walking across the grass will be loaded with meaning. Because the World Cup has always been more than a tournament. It is a global pause, a moment where football becomes a shared language across borders, cultures, and generations. And Messi has been one of the few players capable of uniting fans regardless of club loyalties, national rivalries, or personal preferences. And his presence alone changes how the World Cup is watched, how it is marketed, how stories are told, because broadcasters, journalists, and fans all understand that they are witnessing the closing chapter of something rare. And this final chapter has the power to redefine how legends exit the game, because for decades football has struggled with farewells, icons fading quietly, careers ending not with celebration but with silence, injuries, or unfulfilled expectations. But Messi's final World Cup offers a different narrative, one where legacy is not about perfection but about endurance, resilience, and emotional connection. And that could change how future generations judge greatness, shifting the conversation away from just numbers and trophies toward impact, influence, and the ability to inspire belief. Because Messi's story teaches that greatness is not linear, it is built through failure, doubt, and persistence. And if young players around the world see his final World Cup as a moment of dignity rather than dominance, it could reshape how success is defined in football culture, encouraging patience and loyalty over instant results. And beyond the emotional side, Messi's final World Cup could also influence the future of international football itself, because tournaments are often shaped by their central figures, from Pelé to Maradona to Zidane, and Messi belongs in that lineage of players whose presence elevates the event into something mythic. And when he steps away, there will be a vacuum, not just for Argentina, but for the tournament as a whole, forcing FIFA, broadcasters, and organizers to confront a reality where no single player commands universal attention. And that shift could lead to changes in how the World Cup is promoted, possibly focusing more on teams, narratives, and emerging stars rather than relying on a single global icon. And in that sense, Messi's final World Cup marks the end of an era where one player could carry the emotional weight of the entire tournament. And yet, paradoxically, it may also inspire the next generation to step forward, because history shows that football evolves through transition, and endings often give birth to new legends. But those legends will be judged against the standard Messi set, not just in skill, but in humility, consistency, and love for the game. And there is also the deeper cultural impact to consider, because Messi represents a type of footballing hero that feels increasingly rare, a player who speaks softly, avoids controversy, and lets his football do the talking. And in a world driven by social media noise, branding, and constant opinion cycles, his final World Cup could serve as a reminder that authenticity still matters, that fans still connect most deeply with players who feel real, vulnerable, and human. And that message could influence how future stars present themselves, how academies develop talent, and how clubs and national teams balance marketing with identity. And for Argentina, Messi's final World Cup is not just about defending a title or chasing glory, it's about transition, about preparing a future without the man who defined an entire generation of their football. And how Argentina handles that transition could become a case study for other nations facing similar moments, showing whether it is possible to honor a legend while moving forward without being trapped by the past. And globally, fans will watch not just Argentina's results, but Messi's role within the team, as a leader, a mentor, or a symbol, and that role itself could redefine what it means to age in football, challenging the idea that older players must either dominate or disappear, instead showing that influence can be expressed through intelligence, positioning, and emotional leadership. And when the final whistle eventually blows on Messi's last World Cup match, regardless of the scoreline, football will experience a collective pause, a moment of reflection where fans realize they are saying goodbye not just to a player, but to a feeling. The feeling that football could still surprise, still feel personal, still produce moments that stop time. And that goodbye will ripple through the sport for years to come, influencing documentaries, debates, youth dreams, and even the way future World Cups are remembered. Because history is shaped as much by endings as it is by beginnings, and Messi's final World Cup has the potential to become one of those defining endings, a chapter that future generations will look back on and say, this was the moment football changed. Not because the game stopped being beautiful, but because it was forced to grow up, to move forward without one of its purest artists, and in doing so, it reminded the world why football matters in the first place, not for trophies or rankings, but for the stories, emotions, and shared memories that outlive any single tournament or player. As the conversation around Messi's final World Cup deepens, it also forces football to confront a question it has been quietly avoiding for years. What happens when the game's last universally accepted icon finally steps aside? Because Messi belongs to a rare category of players whose influence extends beyond tactics, rivalries, and even generations. And when his World Cup journey reaches its conclusion, the absence will not feel like a normal retirement. It will feel like the closing of a shared global experience. Because for nearly 2 decades, fans have measured tournaments, seasons, and moments through the lens of what Messi might do next. And that long anticipation has shaped how football stories are told, how highlights are framed, and how history is remembered. And in that sense, his final World Cup does not simply mark the end of his international career, it marks the end of an era where football had a central character. And this shift could fundamentally change how fans emotionally connect to the sport. Because without a singular figure to project hopes, frustrations, and dreams onto, the game may become more fragmented, more tribal, and more dependent on collective narratives rather than individual magic. And yet within that uncertainty lies opportunity, because football has always reinvented itself after the departure of its greatest figures, and Messi's final World Cup could become the blueprint for how legends pass the torch with dignity rather than dominance, showing that greatness does not require one last act of overwhelming superiority, but rather a graceful presence that elevates those around it. And that lesson may influence how future stars approach longevity, encouraging them to value timing, humility, and balance over chasing endless milestones. And from a tactical perspective, Messi's final World Cup also symbolizes the evolution of the game itself, because his style of play, built on close control, spatial awareness, and creative freedom, emerged in an era that allowed room for improvisation, an era where systems adapted to players rather than players being forced into rigid frameworks. And as modern football increasingly emphasizes structure, athleticism, and collective pressing, Messi's final appearance on the world stage could feel like the last echo of a more expressive philosophy, prompting debates about whether the sport has sacrificed artistry for efficiency. And those debates may shape how coaches, academies, and federations define development in the years to come. And culturally, the impact extends even further, because Messi's World Cup presence has always carried a sense of calm amid chaos, a reminder that football does not always need noise to be powerful. And in an age where controversies often overshadow the game itself, his final World Cup could stand as a counter-narrative, emphasizing respect, focus, and quiet leadership. And that image could influence how future captains lead their teams, valuing emotional intelligence as much as physical dominance. And for fans, especially younger ones, who may never experience another World Cup led by a figure like Messi, this final chapter becomes a reference point, a moment they will compare all future tournaments to, saying this is what it felt like when football still had a soul. And whether that perception is entirely fair or shaped by nostalgia does not matter, because football history is written as much by emotion as by fact, and Messi's final World Cup will be remembered through the lens of feeling, not just results. And there is also a powerful commercial and media dimension to consider, because Messi's presence has long been a unifying force in a fragmented media landscape, drawing casual viewers into matches they might otherwise ignore. And when he exits the World Cup stage, broadcasters and sponsors will face the challenge of maintaining global attention without relying on his image, potentially accelerating a shift towards storytelling that focuses on rivalries, national identities, and emerging stars rather than individual superstardom. And that shift could reshape how future World Cups are packaged and consumed, moving away from hero-centric narratives toward more complex, layered storytelling. And for Argentina, Messi's final World Cup also becomes a moment of national introspection, because his journey mirrors the country's relationship with football itself, a mix of passion, pain, pride, and redemption. And how the nation embraces his farewell could influence how it honors legends in the future, setting a precedent for respect and continuity rather than abrupt transition. And on a global scale, his final appearance may encourage fans to slow down, to appreciate moments rather than chase constant novelty, reminding the football world that not every era needs to be louder or faster than the last to be meaningful. And when the tournament eventually moves on without him, the absence will be felt not only in the stadiums, but in living rooms, social media timelines, and late-night conversations among fans who realize they are watching a game that has subtly but irreversibly changed. And that realization may spark a renewed appreciation for football's history, pushing younger audiences to explore past tournaments, legendary matches, and iconic players, reconnecting the present with the past. And in that way, Messi's final World Cup could serve as a bridge rather than an ending, linking generations through shared memory and collective emotion. And as debates continue long after the final match about whether his farewell lived up to expectations, whether it was perfect or imperfect, the most important truth will remain that football was richer for having him, and that his final World Cup was never about closing the door on the beauty of the game, but about reminding the world that beauty does not disappear when legends leave, it simply changes form, and that understanding may be the most lasting legacy. In the end, Messi's final World Cup will not be remembered only for goals, assists, or even results, but for the feeling it left behind, the sense that football paused for a moment to say goodbye to one of its purest expressions. Because his journey on the world's biggest stage represents everything that makes the game timeless: the struggle, the patience, the heartbreak, the redemption, and the quiet joy of watching genius unfold without arrogance. And when the tournament fades into history, what will remain is the realization that an era defined by imagination and emotion has reached its natural conclusion, not with noise or controversy, but with dignity, gratitude, and respect. And as football moves forward into a future shaped by new stars, new systems, and new realities, Messi's final World Cup will stand as a reference point, a reminder of how deeply one player can connect the world through a simple ball, a green pitch, and moments that feel eternal, proving that while players may leave the stage, the stories they create continue to shape the soul of the game long after the final whistle.